thank you all for joining us for the Community-Based Participatory Research Workshop. We have two wonderful presenters with us today. We are fortunate enough to have Dr. Alyssa Crittenden, Vice Provost for Graduate Education and Dean of the Graduate College, and Dr. Jason Flatt, Associate Professor, Social and Behavioral Health here in School of Public Health. So for today's workshop, our structure is a little bit different. We are going to start with presentations from each of our speakers. We'll begin with a presentation from Dr. Crittenden, followed by a presentation from Dr. Flatt. And then for the rest of our session, we will open it up to a Q&A. So we'll welcome our participants to ask any questions at that time, and we have some questions prepared as well. So that is all I would love to say up front, and I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Crittenden. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Alyssa, and thanks so much, Dr. Flatt, for joining us. I'm very eager to see how we differ on some definitions, so I'm very excited to learn with you and from you today. All right, let's see. I did my trial run of sharing my screen. Let's see if we can do it. Now the question is, all right. How's that looking, Alyssa? Yeah, okay. All right, I see Jace nodding. Okay, all right, good. Hi, everyone. So it is a different role and identity that I'm going to be occupying today, and I'll be talking about my work as an anthropologist. I am, in addition to being the Dean of the Graduate College, I am also a professor of anthropology here at UNLV. And I will be talking today about what community-based participatory research, or CBPR, looks like in the context of the work that I do, in the context of my discipline, which is biological anthropology or human biology, depending on sort of which lens you're using. So I'll first provide a definition, one that is typically used in the work that I do. You can find slight variations on this theme depending on what your research background is. I have way too many slides and I have way too much text on my slides. And so I'm breaking my own rule. And so I'll tell all of you what my grandmother used to tell me, do as I say, not as I do. So way too much text, but I have it here for the recording so that if you wanted to come back and review any of the text that I have here, it's available for you to do so. So community-based participatory research, or CBPR, today, the way that I'll be operationalizing it is a collaborative approach to research that equitably, involves community members, wherever they may be, and we'll talk about that in a moment, organizational representatives and/or researchers themselves. In this framework, all partners, as part of a project, will contribute their expertise and will share in the decision-making and the ownership of the outcome of the data of that project in one way or another. And this, of course, is highly variable, and we can talk about what this means and the different approaches and nuances here if you have questions when we get to that part. But the main overarching goal is to combine knowledge with action, at least in this discipline, to achieve social change in some instances and/or improve community outcomes. So we'll be talking a bit about sort of my trajectory as a researcher working with the community who I've worked with, who we'll talk about in a moment, called the Hadza, who are a community who live in northern Tanzania. There's a picture there with some members of the community. So some of the key principles that I focus on, not only when I'm teaching this in a methods class, but also in terms of structuring and framing my own approach to data collection and to community engagement, is to first and foremost recognize the community as a unit of identity. And we'll talk about that in a moment. To build on whatever community strengths and resources are available to you, whatever community that you are working in and with, to promote co-learning and capacity building, and to emphasize relevance and sustainability. And I use the word sustainability, and that can be operationalized with every different community you work with, but it's really centering what the community is asking, or what the community needs, or community approaches to answering certain questions. And I'll center this concept, and we can maybe unpack it together later, but for me, one of the key principles in the approach that I use is that communities are themselves collective agents, whatever that community may be, who you are working with. And so recognizing that communities are defined by these shared identities, whatever that may be under question: geography, culture, lived experience, language, social ties. We're going to talk a bit about how the community I work with is really a collective agent in a lot of political contexts in the country of their national origin. But this idea that communities themselves are collective agents, I think, is a really important part of the approach. I'll be talking a bit today about behavioral observation, and I do so intentionally. And I do so intentionally because I have worked in this community and in my discipline for over 20 years. And many folks who do the type of work that I do, particularly when you're asking questions that are related to human biology or human health, maternal and infant health and well being, I have often encountered colleagues who say, well, really, you can't do community-based participatory research if you're a biological scientist. And I absolutely think that is fundamentally wrong. And so I hope to convince you of that by the end of today, which is why I've picked the studies that I've picked today in order to demonstrate that. But we have to start with thinking about behavioral observation. So for many social scientists, behavioral observation is sort of the cornerstone of a lot of the work we do. Certainly that's the case in a lot of anthropology. And behavioral observation is important. It helps us do a lot of things. We'll talk about interviews, we'll talk about focus groups, we can talk about a whole bevy of other methods here, but I use behavioral observation in particular because it's often one of the ones in my discipline anyway, it's one of the methods that is often argued to not be able to tether to CBPR or that approach at all. So it's really so direct observation or indirect, and we'll talk about that in a minute, is really valuable across disciplines. Here, for me, it's in the context of anthropology, but it can be used in a variety of other disciplines as well. I know this is really wordy, so we're not going to spend a lot of time because I want to get to my case studies. But in terms of observation, and this is often for those social scientists on or behavioral scientists who might be on the call, there's a really wonderful opportunity that's made available through the National Science Foundation, and it's called NSF Methods Camp. And I taught a couple of online courses for NSF Methods Camp, and so I pulled this information directly from that content because I think that it sort of summarizes it in a way. So apologies for all the text, but there's a lot on here. So I differentiate between indirect and direct observation on this slide. So things like time diaries or things that I often collect, which are 24-hour dietary recalls, daily logs. We'll talk about one type of those logs in a moment. Experience sampling. How do you thread in CBPR to this type of work? Well, I often have my research participants co-design or adapt tools. So you come to the field with something that you think might be relevant for a particular question. You come to the community, and then you work to modify that. You work to adapt whatever that instrumentation is so that it is culturally relevant and meaningful. Community members may themselves interpret patterns in the data based on whatever local expertise they have. And it's really useful for capturing lived experiences over time. And so we can talk a bit about what experience sampling is if you're interested later. Direct observation in this context is what we as anthropologists refer to, and also other social scientists refer to as participant observation. Things like scan sampling or focal follows, things that are really sort of nomothetic in nature, right? You count them, you measure them, stuff that you can count and measure, which I was told for many, many years before I started CBPR that I simply couldn't do that type of work as a biological anthropologist and have it be community-based. I disagree. And many people who are much smarter than I am, who have spent many more years doing this, are also in the same boat. So you can, oh, let me go back. You can train your co-researchers, so co-data collectors from the community. This works to build trust and, importantly, access to different cultural and ecological settings. And it helps ensure that your observations, so essentially the type of data that you are collecting, are contextually appropriate and respectful to the community with whom you are working. I'll introduce the community I work with, and then I will give you a few examples of the work that I do in this context. I know this is a very kind of 10,000 foot view overview of what this means, but I wanted to give you some very specific examples of what this looks like on the ground in the work that I've been doing over the past 2 decades with this community. So you can see the image of the African continent, and you can see sort of very vaguely there in Tanzania and East Africa, where the community with whom I work resides. There are about 1,000 members of the community. They refer to themselves as Hadzabe. Often in the literature, they referred to as Hadza. They subsist by what's called a mixed subsistence food economy. So historically, they were exclusively hunters and gatherers, meaning that they were a highly mobile population that subsisted entirely off of wild foraged resources. So this would be foraged plant foods or um, hunted game animals and avian species or collected wild honey. Now that diet is largely infused with foods from a market economy, foods that they have either purchased or traded or been given. So more agricultural products. So it's roughly depends on where you are, but in some camps, it's more agricultural products and less wild foods, and then in some camps that reverses. But in any instance, it's what we refer to as a mixed subsistence food economy. So they're eating both. So they still identify as a foraging community. In the literature, sometimes you see it as foraging and formerly foraging. They still maintain fluid residential patterns. They typically, historically, the community would travel based on access to resources and based on seasonality, and they would follow the resources around the environment. Less so today. They tend to be more settled nowadays. They have distributed and communal childcare, and they remain in very tightly knit multi-generational communities. And all of this will come to play when we start talking about the questions that I work with the community to unpack. So the first example I'm going to give you is going way back to my dissertation, and I pulled this one. I dusted it off on purpose for all of the graduate students on the call. So I picked up this gem and I blew all the dust off. And I thought I would talk to you about this particular study. So this was the first time that I did community-based participatory research, and I had no idea that that's what I was doing. And in fact, I shall not name names, but one of the advisors on my committee actually said to me, I'm not sure what this is that you're doing. I don't know what method this is, but I'm not so sure you have a citation for what you're doing. It turns out I did, right? But I just didn't know what I was doing. So we're going to go through this sort of evolution of my research here. So this was a study that I did on what we refer to in the anthropological literature as allo-maternal care, or essentially the helpers. So who is helping parents, allo-parental care or allo-maternal care? Who is helping the parents? So in this particular study, I was focused on mothers, but I did a very large study looking at households in general, sort of like kind of testing the hypothesis that it takes, you've all heard that phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. Part of my dissertation was testing that in this community. So what was interesting about this is that we did the whole data collection. I'm going to show you an actual data sheet that I pulled from my dissertation here in a moment. But the important part of this is that I asked the local caregivers in the community to help me define the most important categories and to help me figure out what was the most important stuff to measure when I was looking at how do we figure out who's holding all these babies and why? Why are certain people holding these babies? So this is an example of a data collection sheet. I've blacked out a lot of things because one of the most important things is maintaining anonymity in your data when this is part of the study, and this is important to the community. And you'll see that even the individual identification numbers there in the comments are there because, because, let's see, how do I go back? Oh, Alyssa, user error. Okay, everybody close your eyes. Okay, there we go. All right, is how do you code all of your data? So we don't have to go over this. We do not have to belabor this data sheet. I show you this data sheet to demonstrate to you that you can have data that is essentially quantitative data, and you can collect quantitative data on things and still have it be rooted in community-based participatory research. So what are our results? These results, don't pay too much attention to the results. There's the paper if you're interested. It's from 100 years ago, from 2008. But the most important part of this is that when you go down to that section where it says other kin, where it says other kin represents various categories of helpers, because individuals may fall in more than one category, the sample size is not known, right? So how does this work? Well, I had the community members tell me which category folks fell into. And so folks fell into multiple different categories. And so when I used that category, my first version of this paper, I was told that I had to, well, we can get into that, but it got published anyhow. It's been cited many, many times. And we used essentially the residence patterns and the kin terms that the community themselves derived, and that the community themselves told me were the meaningful ways to measure this type of investment in this community. And basically, what do we find out? Yes, it takes a village to raise a child, and we have demonstrated evidence to support that with this particular paper. So I didn't know exactly what I was doing, but that was the first time that I thought, we should probably ask the folks who we're working with what is the best way to go about this. And that had not actually, I was not trained how to do that initially. I since then have been trained, but this was very early on as a graduate student. Okay, the second one, essentially a child's eye view. So kids are sharing what they eat, how they spend their time, and how they contribute to family labor. This particular study was a study that was the first time that I had community members ask me to do a particular type of research project. I was more than happy to do so because I had spent so many years working with the children already. But this was where the first time that my first data collectors who I ever worked with, my very first community data collectors, my very first introduction into having community members drive the questions was with children. And so that's why I wanted to bring that here. The results of the study are perhaps less interesting than the method itself. This was used to really demonstrate that in this particular case, there were differences that we saw in childhood that sort of mapped onto differences we saw in adulthood. The results here are not necessarily impactful in general, but it was more the method at play. And I saw children's meals for the very first time. It was the first time that I learned that communities of children have their own complete agency all around the world. And this led to years of cross-cultural research in urban and peri-urban contexts in cities and in other rural dwelling populations, where we looked at kind of the world that kids build on their own and what impact that has, not only for policy, but for things like access to education, for lifelong health and well-being. So this was the first time that I worked with kids, and they introduced me directly into their world and demonstrated to me what were the important research questions and what I should be focusing on. This third study is a little further on in my career. This one was probably maybe about 10 years ago. And this one is co-sleeping and nighttime infant care. So this one was a specific request from women in the community who asked me to come and do a project on co-sleeping. So where you sleep with your infant, you often breastfeed at night while you are sleeping. Many folks in the anthropological literature have written about this in small scale societies, but this was a particular project that was brought to me. And it's essentially a health equity project that the community asked to highlight co-sleeping in their own community priorities, because at this point they had a lot of traveling medical care providers coming into the community, encouraging them not to co-sleep. That is really not an option in this particular community, but we'll talk about sort of the important salient parts of engaging the community in this in a moment. So we use daily sleep logs that were developed collaboratively with moms to not only ensure cultural fit, but also linguistic fit. And this is important. We had to do a lot of translating and back translating. Most data are collected, most research is done in Swahili, which is the second language of the participant population. But much of this had to be done in Hadzane and then translated through, because they asked to have a dream log. So they asked to be able to wake up and go tell researchers what their dreams were, which was sort of, we would have assumed was kind of unrelated to co-sleeping, but it absolutely is not unrelated from the community. And so that is what they wanted to do. They wanted to have dreams included. So we also had a lot of community data collectors who helped with this. We also included non-invasive sleep monitors. So an actigraph watch, you can see a little kind of cartoon of an image there that was introduced by the community liaisons. And these particular data were used for a variety of other reasons, but this was really a braided knowledge approach. So we did sort of some of the data collection that the community wanted and other stuff that they were interested in, but wasn't necessarily important in terms of policy and access to health education. So what we found is that mothers and elders in particular contributed perspectives on what sleep disruptions meant in context. So, what this meant is that the idea long held is that if you co sleep, it's tethered to sleep deprivation and lower health outcomes in the community. And there's a lot of safety things we can talk about as well in terms of how this translates to North Atlantic contexts like ours, but we'll get there in a moment. The important part here in this particular study is that the goal wasn't to fix co-sleeping practices. In fact, the participating parents, moms, they wanted to advocate for different public health messaging in their community that reflected their own reality and their lived experience of what it is like to be in a highly mobile context. You can see the grass homes in which they live behind them in this particular photo. And last but not least, I wanted to talk about the work that I'm doing at this very moment. This is a very long project. This is a long-term project. This is an example of what we refer to as slow science. The project began roughly 7 years ago, 7 years ago, and it's continuing to this day. It began with community concerns about water safety and water access, and it has grown into the largest sustained research partnership I've had across multiple communities of Hadza participants. And the community members have driven every stage of this research. They identified the issues, they decided they wanted to do the work, they designed many of the tools for analysis, they've collected many of the samples that you see here, they have helped with the analysis of data, and some of them have even presented results to various stakeholders, whether that be to the local government or some collaborators, Hadza collaborators have actually presented these results at conferences with me. So really from the beginning to the end, they have been part of this. And it examines overarchingly how the social, economic, and environmental equities in their environment impact who gets water, when they get water, how they get water, and at what cost. So you'll see the first two pictures are of Hadza folks accessing water, an increasingly dwindling supply. And on the far right, you see two members standing, two people from a different ethnic community standing on logs, reaching down to get a bucket to bring water up for their herd animals. And that is traditionally Hadza land. And those folks are there feeding about 300 ungulates or 300 goats and cattle every single day from what is a traditional watering hole of the community with whom I work. So you can see why this was a research project that they brought, that they said this is what we want to do and this matters to us. So each case hopefully demonstrated how direct observation methods, even in the context of anthropology and in some cases human biology, can be adapted within a CBPR framework. And I argue that it enriches our understanding of human behavior, human health, human ecology. For the reasons listed there, these communities can become your collaborators, not necessarily just your test subjects. And I argue that this approach will produce more ethical, accurate, and relevant science. So it's about sort of approaching your work and your studies around questions that matter to the community at the center of that work, not just in an academic context. And I leave you with a photo of one of my former postdocs who is now a career research scientist at the University of Vienna, Stephanie Schnorr, with a quote that's from the 70s, but I think is still relevant today. Knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention, through the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry people pursue in the world, with the world, and importantly, with each other. So with that, I say thank you. Thank you to my collaborators. Thank you to the Hadzabe community. And if you are interested and you find yourself with the moment, please look up the Olanakwe Community Fund. This is unrelated to my research, but of course, completely related to my research. After 10 years in the community, probably 15 years in the community. A lot of my Hadza friends approached me and asked if I would help them set up a mutual aid organization where we could fundraise in the US but be operational in Tanzania. And we are. Olanakwe is the Hadzane word for children. So you can go take a peek there and look at what community-based educational programs and economic development projects the community has identified for themselves. We are now at the point where we're starting to tether our research to the mutual aid. Come back in 10 years and I will tell you how that's going. Again, slow science, but that is where we are. So thank you. And I'm sorry I took so long.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. We can go ahead and transition to Dr. Flatt, but wow, it's just fascinating how the ways in which the community was involved and the asks that they had, just fascinating. Thank you so much. I will turn it over to you, Dr. Flatt.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Crittenden. All right, so I'm going to give you an example. I think this is really great. We're both giving you examples from our work of how
Oh,
CVPR applies.
sorry, Dr. Flatt, before you get too
Yeah,
deep, I just want to let you know we can see the presenter view.
okay, thank you. That's weird. I showed it before and now it's
There it
swapped
goes.
again.
It's up.
Okay, all
Thank you.
right, that's totally fine. So yeah, we want to show you some examples from our own work, and I also have way too many slides. So I'm gonna move through some of these quickly for you. I want to just jump into first share. I'm gonna put this in the chat for you. But I worked with an incredible group here at UNLV with the Nevada Minority Health Equity Coalition, and they put together a toolkit. So if you're interested in accessing it, it's completely free. We developed this, and so it's a really nice toolkit that walks you through some unique pieces around how you would actually implement community-based participatory research in the community. So check it out. So I'm gonna start with just sharing with you a lot of my work, right, is based in public health. And so I'm using some of the CBPR principles that come from Barbara Israel. And so really thinking about in public health, it's as a partnership approach where we ensure that research is truly equitable, that community members, organizations, and researchers are involved in all phases of the research process. So that's from the part of defining who the community is to the piece of collecting data, interpreting that data and disseminating what we learn back to the communities we work with. So my work is informed by sort of these 9 principles from Barbara Israel that has been learned from the communities she worked with in Detroit, really around sort of health equity, social determinants of health, and thinking about socio-ecological perspectives. So I'm going to jump into the example that I wanted to share with you, and I think it's really exciting. It's relevant to Las Vegas. And so we developed a partnership with our local LGBT center, the city of Las Vegas, our school, and the Nevada Minority Health Equity Coalition. And this really came about during COVID when we were seeing really huge impacts in terms of people being unemployed, concerns in our community around being unhoused or experiencing housing insecurity. And so that's really where this partnership came out. And so I want to give you an example today of how we really brought in some participatory research methods to learn about the needs of the community and come up with some potential strategies of how we might address the needs. And so it's called Building House Las Vegas. And so in our example, it's an interdisciplinary team. We brought in several partners, but the leading partners were faculty of UNLV and the leadership of our local LGBT center or the center. And really our goal was to bring everybody together to try to find solutions that would work to address the housing needs of LGBTQIA+ people here in Southern Nevada. So we started off the work. What's really wonderful is I teach a community-based participatory research class. I was actually teaching it last night and went through some of these examples. In that class, my students got to get involved in talking with community leaders and community organizations around the needs of the community in Las Vegas, around being unhoused and experiencing housing insecurity. And so we did 12 key informant interviews initially with groups such as people from the Salvation Army, people from the Legal Aid of Southern Nevada, from the Nevada Partnership for Homeless Youth, with Clark County Social Service and US Vets, really 12 different kind of leaders or partners that are doing the work so we could really understand how is the community being impacted. And so here I show you the interview questions that were asked. So this led to us really learning some of the initial needs. And I'm not going to go through these quotes, but I wanted to just show you sort of what we were hearing initially. And so what stood out to us are things like we need innovation. And there are really unique challenges for the LGBTQIA plus community around trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. So that was some of the things we were hearing. We also heard, right, that there were some really unique needs around, we don't have enough data. We don't specifically know how much the LGBTQIA plus community is being impacted. We also need to make sure that there's more friendly housing that meets the needs of people, as well as we were hearing things like the housing that people have is not sustainable when we think about housing insecurity. And so there were pieces where people are overhoused, right? Their rent or their mortgage is more than they can afford based on their current income. And so also ensuring that everybody could have access to resources and needs in the community. So this led us to bringing the community together in April of 2022. We hosted a community forum at our local LGBT center, the center, and we wanted to go through a participatory method to really learn what does the community see in terms of current challenges. And so this is just the schedule that we had for the day. I'm actually showing you the slides that I showed to the participants when we were doing that housing forum. So we first walked them through a concept mapping activity. So we wanted to tell them really our goal for that day when we got together is to think about both finding solutions that were culturally tailored and also really think about the needs of the community in terms of housing insecurity and health challenges. And so through our talking and thinking about brainstorming, we came to thinking about concept mapping as a participatory way to collect data and interpret it with the community to come up with some solutions to address some of the current challenges. And so concept mapping is a mixed methods approach. It actually involves where you collect some qualitative data first prior to then getting quantitative data. So we call it sort of this exploratory sequential process. And so we used a unique software in this, which was called Group Wisdom. And so we were able to use the technology to collect and organize the data. And so we walked the participants through using that. And so it's just a unique software that you can use as a tool to help with making decisions, but also engage people in the data collection process. And so here I show you just sort of the key 6 phases where we get them prepared, we start generating ideas, we then start organizing those ideas, really sort of a very quick kind of thematic analysis. Then we look through that data and it helps us to basically interpret as a group. So through each of the phases, we had a debrief session where we would actually walk around the room and be passing the microphone to hear people's thoughts or sort of them to give us some more insight into why maybe they suggested something or why they coded something a certain way. And then we got a final concept map at the end, which I'll show to you. So these were the instructions for them to let them know what activities we were going to be doing. So first was a brainstorming activity where we were going to ask them a little bit about their background, and then we were going to ask them to list as many potential solutions that they could think about that could help to address the housing needs of the LGBTQIA+ community. Then working with actually my grad students, right, at each round table, the grad students were going to facilitate how can we organize these ideas by really thinking about similarities and putting them into piles and naming those piles. And I'll show you some examples in a minute. And then at the end, they got to rate all the ideas from those that they considered least important to extremely important. And this, I just love to show you always examples. So we did get IRB approval for this. It took a little bit of work. I had to teach the IRB a little bit about community-based participatory research, but we did get it approved. And so this was sort of what we showed, as well as putting this on all the tables to let participants know what we were doing that day was for research purposes. So they first got, as part of the introduction to concept mapping, we wanted to learn a little bit about who was there. And so we asked them these 5 questions around what organization or group were they from? Were they a community member? How long were they at the organization? We asked about their sexual orientation and gender identity. And then we wanted to know if people had experienced housing insecurity or homelessness. And so these links don't work anymore, but these were the links that the participants were actually using. And we also had laptops at the tables so that people could fill out the survey. So this is what they saw. They would go to this first page and they would actually see the options where first the participant questions would come up. And then they would, after completing the questions, they would get to go to the brainstorming activity. And what was unique in this software program is we are also able to get an informed consent. So as part of the intro, we walked them through the research purposes and they had to give consent to participate. So what you're seeing here is actually the software. So they would actually see this, and in the screen, they would get a question to list as many potential solutions that could address the housing and needs of the community. And what was really unique is as they entered an idea, then they would start to see from everybody, these collected statements would start to populate. So they would get to see other people's ideas with the hope that maybe we don't get too many repeat ideas, but also we were encouraging them to split up their ideas. So say, for instance, if they said, to address housing, we need to address mental health, and we also need to make sure there's subsidies so people can pay their utilities. So we would say, that's actually 2 ideas, so make sure to split those into 2 when you submit them. But if they didn't, we actually, on the background, were able to split those apart. So this is what they got, and then they were asked to, go to this link and fill it out. Next, we also had to prompt them, make sure you click finish. So again, these slides are actually from what the participants saw, because if they did not hit finish, it would not store their ideas into the background of the software. Next, we told them about the sorting activity. And this is where they worked with a grad student at their round table. And they were told that they were going to basically take all the ideas that they provided to us, and we could have up to 125. So during the debrief session, after we generated ideas in the brainstorming, we walked around with a microphone and everyone got to share a little bit about the ideas that they submitted. And during that time where the community was discussing, we had one of our grad students making sure we could get all the ideas that maybe had more than one statement in them broken up into separate ones, and also delete any duplicates, because you could only have a max of 125. So then at their tables, they were assigned with the facilitator to take all these up to 125 ideas and group them into sort of thematic areas or piles and name those piles based on what they saw them representing. So this is what they would see. So on the left-hand side where you see the cards, these are all the ideas. And what's unique is that the software randomizes all the ideas, so not every group sees it the same way. So that way we would get unique piles in terms of how people might organize them. And so you see this as an example, and we also had to remind them, hit finish when you're done, or it will not be stored into the system. So this is what they would see in terms of this, and the facilitator would do it. So after we did the sorting, we also did a debriefing where we talked about each of the tables, how they decided to categorize a lot of these ideas. We broke for lunch, and then when we came back, as we were working on the back end to organize some of the pieces, we had participants at each table individually rank the 120, I think it was 124 ideas. I can't quite recall the exact number, but we were near the max. And so they got to rate them in their level of importance. And you'll see why we do that next. And we also debriefed after this to talk a little bit around the ones that people viewed as most important. So this is the demographics of the participants that attended. And so you can see in terms of it, we had a lot of people from educational or research backgrounds, nearly a third. We had people that were housing providers, people that worked in healthcare, but you can also see about 25% or 1 in 4 said other, and these were community members that were attending. So more than half of the community there that day identified as a member of the LGBTQIA+ community. Something really important is we see unique concerns for the transgender community. So about 1 in 4 identified as a gender minority, and over 40% said they were experiencing housing insecurity or homelessness in the past year. So we did get a good number of people in terms of experiencing that. This is the final concept map, right? So based on this, we brought the initial map to the group at near the end of that day, and then we talked about it and then came up with the exact labels for each of these. What I don't show you today that would be unique is that you actually can map all 125 ideas into these different sort of categories if you wanted to. But basically representing training and education, the need for data collection, community collaboration, housing policies, programming, the needs for subsidies and financial support, housing resources, and then community tailored housing. In terms of the top ranking, we got to share this as well. These were the top areas that people had rated as most important to address. And so you can see collaboration between service providers was seen as really high, as well as thinking about housing policies. So I have on the left the idea, and then you can see where it fell in the concept map in terms of sort of where it would clustered. So we took all this, we had an advisory board, we met with them, and then we decided to go back and meet with the community again in March of 2024. What was unique is that we actually collaboratively wrote a grant that was funded by the Mountain West Clinical Translational Science Institute to do this additional work. And so we did a nominal group technique, brought everybody back that we could, as well as invited some new people. And we went through these ideas and used the nominal group process, which is a participatory approach, really to have people kind of rank which ideas would be most important to move forward with. And so we used a modified traffic light example because I could not find something that had a green sticker and all those little colored dots. And so we went through this process, and then I'm gonna close very soon, so don't worry, Alyssa. And these were the top ideas. The first one was to think about community resource navigators. The next idea that rose to the top was thinking about senior housing. The third idea was focused on housing, developing a housing coalition. And the fourth idea focused on scalable, affordable housing with wraparound services. So this just shows you how you can use a participatory approach to identify solutions to address the needs of a community, really falling in line with community-based participatory research approaches. And that is the end.
Well, thank you so much. It's just wonderful to see like such a difference between the work that you both have done, although certainly some overlaps too. But folks on the call, now is our opportunity to open it up to questions. So if you have any questions, please feel welcome to raise your hand and unmute or type in the chat. But while you are thinking of these questions, I'm going to kick us off. And I just want to start with the big why question. Like, why would you go this route? What are the benefits of using a CBPR approach compared to traditional research methods? Dr. Flatt, what would you say about that?
So I would say, like, I'll admit, I haven't experienced housing insecurity or been unhoused. So I don't know what the right solutions would be to address the needs of the community. And so the best way to learn about that is to go and ask people that have actually been impacted or work with community members, right? Because I might pick something that more than likely will not work. So that would be the reason I would say it.
Thank you. Dr. Crittenden, what are your views?
So it's slightly different, sort of from the discipline where I work. But I think honestly, for me personally, it's maybe a different. I'll just talk about kind of in general why I moved this way. I think I moved this way because I have worked with an Indigenous community for so long, that it became really important for my research and the research of my students and my collaborators to center on their sovereignty, their self-determination, and their own community wellness. And so it just wasn't research that I was interested in doing. Um, After maybe my first field season, after a couple of years, I didn't even know what this was, right? Because as a trained biological anthropologist and behavioral ecologist and human biologist, these weren't even methods that were introduced to me. And so I didn't understand why the science felt like it was missing so much. And of course, it was missing the actual perspectives of the human beings at the center of the questions, which Dr. Flatt just articulated very well. So I think that was the reason for me. But I think in general, from my discipline, I think that it really is, particularly if you're interested in research that has some type of, well, even if it doesn't have an applied perspective, but I think if it certainly has an applied perspective, if you're looking for any type, if you're doing any type of intervention work, not including the community, is really problematic. And I can talk about why I think that's the case. But even if you're not doing applied work, I still argue that it leads to better science, and not only just more ethical science, but better science, to have this type of approach. So, and I can wax poetic on how I think that's the case, even for data that folks argue is unbiased data collection. I have some strong thoughts on that, but I don't want to. That's my answer because I can keep going. Sorry, Alyssa.
Thank you so much. So we do have some questions in the chat, so I'd love to address those first. So from Miriam, how do you manage research fatigue with participants? Ethical compensation for time and experience, question mark? Whoever would like to jump in.
I'm happy to. That can be hard, right? And so one of the big pieces that when you get do this work, you have to identify sort of what the community would want, like what would be the exact benefits for them, both personally, but also, right, in an academic piece, often we're going after grants. And so what we try to do is make sure, like, what is considered equitable compensation and what would that need to be? And so some of that might be in the forms of honorarium payments, that might be purchasing meals, paying people for their time, or also giving other forms of non-monetary credit, like featuring the partners in a local newspaper article so they get credit for being a part of it, giving them acknowledgements. We, for instance, host the community forum and we have community members actually present during it to give them an opportunity, right, to show sort of their involvement with the leadership role and get credit for it. So it's a hard piece, and with the tough climate in grant funding and stuff, it's sometimes the financial piece is not truly equitable. And so you have to balance it. And usually I err on the side of transparency of just like, this is how it works. Here are the different pieces. Here's what the university would get. Here's what community members would get. And we negotiate that from the beginning, not after the grant is awarded. So.
Yes, to all that, +1. I will focus a bit on minimizing participant burden because this tends to be more relevant in the work that I do. So in my discipline, well, I shouldn't say my discipline, we have a tendency in the academy, I think, to emphasize replication, reproducibility over and over and over again, rigor, 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 right? The problem is that I really think that we need to start focusing on reducing that redundancy for participating communities. And so what that means in the way that I sort of actualize this is I care very much about streamlining surveys. I care very much about streamlining interviews. I care very much about keeping them short and purposeful when you're doing that type of work. I try very hard now to avoid overlapping data collection. And I try to work with collaborators to reduce sort of redundancy. So what this means is that I'm in this type, I guess in this phase of my career, I'm doing a lot of what I would refer to as conceptual replication with my students. So testing sort of a mechanism behind something or kind of the theory behind something in a different context with slight variations that are driven by the community. So I pool a lot of data. I share a lot of instrumentation and protocols with other folks. And importantly, I now ask the community what questions still feel unresolved so that I'm not coming back with questions that they brought to me and revisiting them and just sort of piling on with all of the data, because it can very much feel, at least to the community with whom I'm work, that this has already been studied. Didn't we already figure this out? Why are we back here doing this again? And so I always ask the question, like, what value is added in revisiting this topic and how is the community going to respond to that? So I think I just sort of let that drive the way that I think about it. In terms of compensation, that's really different with the group that I work in, but I think that my short answer, I suppose, would be to think about what is a tangible benefit for that participant community. So sometimes it would be compensation, sometimes it's resources, sometimes it's actually policy impact and like community reports that are asked for. So we did a UN impact report, and that's like all the community data collectors wanted, and they could download it onto their phone. And then we translated it into Swahili. And so we're like, okay, that's what they wanted for that, right? So I mean, I think that would be my short answer, but then you have to balance that with not only your institutional IRB, but as Dr. Flatt already stated, you also have to balance that with your granting agencies. So what is going to get past review, but is also going to be a meaningful and tangible benefit for that community.
Thank you both so much. I know we are nearing the end of our session, but I wanted to see if we could squeeze in one or two. So Dr. Flatt, this question is directed at you. What was your strategy for getting the desired number of participants? Did you get the number of participants you wanted? Were there some community groups that you were not able to reach?
Yeah. So a lot of it was tapping into word of mouth. So we started with the key informants, and something I didn't share with you is part of the questions we asked them were like, who are all the partners and community members that we should be inviting to the community forum that we want to hold, right? So that was a big focus to help us try to be broader than just our own networks, try to think about other people's networks. And so we were really happy with the number that we got at the community forum. It was over 40 people, but there was a challenge. We realized, and we knew this already, but in order to get organizational leaders, that meant we had to schedule it between a 9 to 5 working time versus to get community members, the hours that they might be available when we were exploring were much more variable, right? So it could be some wanted weekends, some wanted nights, some wanted early in the day, right? Thinking of our Las Vegas workers, especially people that maybe are working but are still housing insecure. So it was kind of hard. So what we did actually in the next phase, given we did notice there were certain community members that we did not get as much participation with, subgroups, is we had individual focus groups that we could schedule at different times. We actually went to some of the transitional housing locations and did interviews with community members there. Really the best way is to meet people where they are versus expecting them maybe to come to the LGBT center or especially not come to UNLV. And so those were some of the pieces. So we were happy with it. I think we always could have gotten more. But you know, for what we learned and sort of some of these solutions, I felt like we did a decent job, but probably in terms of people that were unhoused, we didn't get as many, right? Given barriers and challenges. And so we would have liked more input with people with lived experiences, but we did do some focus groups actually at the LGBT center as well when they were doing their they twice a month do a food bank. And so we went there during that time and recruited community members and we paid them $25 and also gave a meal. So, but it's a hard balance.
Thank you very much for sharing that extra context. And so it's 3 o'clock. If you need to jump off, we completely understand. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us. Dr. Flatt and Dr. Crittenden, thank you very much. I did drop our workshop feedback survey in the chat there as well. So participants, if you have a moment to fill that out, we greatly appreciate it. Helps inform future programming, and we definitely appreciate it. And while some may need to jump off, it looks like Dr. Crittenden might have a moment to address Anna's last question in the chat here. So I'll turn it over to you to that.
That's such a good question. I couldn't let it just sit there in chat. So this is like the story of my life. So I have a lot of kind of empathy for where you are right now. I would first like to say that I don't think that CBPR requires that you abandon any post-positivist roots. I think that's what I was trying to sort of demonstrate with my talk. I think that it really asks of you to expand what you're counting as knowledge, what you're counting as data, who gets to produce it, and how you use it, right? And so I think one of the things one of the things I could recommend is that you can create sort of shared protocols. So essentially, there tends to be this braided knowledge approach, right? So you create those shared protocols. You consider research designs that may test a particular theory that you're interested in, while also addressing a real world issue that has been brought to you by the community understudy. And so I tend to do a lot of that because honestly, that's how I get funded through NSF, right? So that it is that secret sauce, which actually has led to my continued funding through NSF. And I am a mixed methods research scientist, and so I'm always going to tell you to lean in. So I have to admit that I'm super biased in that space because I think that sort of mixed evaluation criteria, a lot of the amazing work that we saw today, I mean, now I want to do concept mapping. And so I was taking my own notes, right, about how amazing this is because your community partners then sort of help you define what counts as success or what counts as a relevant outcome in your project. And so I think it's a slow journey. Have grace with yourself. But if you are interested, you can always shoot me an email and I can tell you sort of what not to do. I can share some of my pitfalls for how I approached my committee and it did not work as a grad student. And then how I went rogue as an assistant professor and it all sort of came together. So great question. Thank you.
I also think like when you create measures, you often use qualitative methods to think about new measures, right? The questions, or even when we test like reliability and validity of measures, we're doing cognitive interviews to see like, do people understand what we're asking? So qualitative methods has a value in this post-positivist piece. It, it just depends on how you want to use it. So.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for addressing all of our questions there, and thank you to those who had questions to pose. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day. Enjoy your afternoon. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for
Yeah.
organizing. So nice to meet you, Alyssa, on here,
Nice to
I
meet
think
you,
you're like
Jay.
maybe, yeah, are you in the grad college or?
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
like one floor below you right at
Downstairs.
this
Oh,
moment.
I love it. It's like, yeah, and we've never met each other in person. It's ridiculous. But yeah, it's really nice to see you on here.
Nice to see you
And
too,
thank
and
you.
thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
I've been watching your work for some time, so this was
Aw,
an
and
honor.
thank you. You know what I'm referring to. Just thank you so much.
Our
So,
pleasure. If only I
yeah,
could do more.
yeah.
So thank
Okay.
you.
All
And
right.
thanks, Alyssa. Great job. Per the usual.
Thank you.
Bye.